Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for the Deltascape version 2.0. This is the second encounter in the brand new raid made available by patch 4.01 in Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood. I can see why this encounter may look difficult, but perhaps I just don't understand the gravity of the situation. My name is Ms. Tech and I'll help you avoid catastrophe. All players will notice they have an anti-gravity gimbal duty action button that will cause them to levitate. This will be used throughout the encounter to avoid certain mechanics, but beware. Once you're levitating, you cannot unlevitate unless the boss makes you, so be careful to use it only when appropriate, or you might find yourself in some bad situations. Trembler will do mild raid-wide damage. Earthquake is the first levitate mechanic you'll need to watch out for. It will do high raid-wide damage and place a stacking vulnerability up debuff on anyone not levitating during this cast. 100 Gs will be cast anytime someone in the party is levitating and will essentially pull any of those players back down to the ground. EVILSPHERE is a moderate to high damage tankbuster. Cool down and heal through this as necessary. The boss can spawn an ethereal rift under the platform, causing all players to begin to sink into the ground. If they sink too far, they will die. To avoid this, use your duty action to levitate over the rift. Gravitational explosion will mark up a player for this stack up marker, and players will need to stack in to share that damage. Be careful here. If the player is levitating and everyone else isn't, they aren't technically stacked and you'll probably die. Paranormal wave is a large frontal cone with no cast, and tanks should make sure they never face the boss towards the raid. Maniacal probe will spawn 4 tentacles around the room that will react to the land's energy. When Catastrophe casts Epicenter, it'll send out a shockwave activating tentacles and marking them up with this eyeball looking marker. A tentacle with this marker is dangerous and should be avoided. Eventually, all of the energy from the Epicenter cast will settle on one tentacle, and that energy will be released with a huge point-blank AoE attack from the tentacle. Getting hit by this will do high damage and place a stacking vulnerability up debuff on you. Players will need to watch out for which tentacles the energy settles to and move away from them as necessary. Anti-light will cause a number of spheres to spawn around the platform. PETROSPHERES have these large black AoE indicators that cover the entirety of the platform and will petrify anyone on the ground and add a stacking vulnerability up debuff. To avoid this, players will need to be levitating. Demon Eye is a gaze attack that will petrify and debuff players hit. You'll need to turn away from the boss to avoid this while dodging spheres. During anti-light, Catastrophe can also spawn PETROSPHERES and potent PETROSPHERES together. Potent PETROSPHERES have large white AoE indicators that will also cover the entirety of the platform, but are actually floating. If you look closely, you'll notice that the indicators of each type of sphere are actually on different levels. That means players levitating into these potent PETROSPHERES will be hit and debuffed. In this pattern of spheres, the boss will cast 100 Gs, pulling all players down to the ground. To avoid getting petrified, players will have to move into the very center of the room, where there is a tiny safe zone in between the PETROSPHERE indicators. It can be difficult to see since the potent PETROSPHERES indicators overlap it, but remember that those are on another plane and you won't be hit by them once the boss pulls you down. In the next Maniacal probe, the land's energy will gather on 2 tentacles this time. Be sure to avoid them as necessary. When the boss casts negative 100 Gs, a pattern of spheres will spawn around the room with 2 narrow safe zones in the north and south of the platform. All players will be thrown up into the air, and the spheres will explode as soon as they land. To avoid the sphere attacks, players will need to ensure that they're in one of the safe zones before they're knocked up, so that they can land safely and avoid excess damage or even death. Gravitational wave will do high raid-wide damage that will need to be healed through as necessary. For this anti-light pattern, only potent PETROSPHERES will spawn, and players will need to make sure not to pop levitate to avoid them. However, as the spheres explode, the ethereal rift will form beneath you, pulling you down. To survive, players will need to levitate once the spheres explode. On the next Maniacal probe, you guessed it, 3 tentacles will gather all of the energy, and you'll only have 1 safe zone to use to avoid the attacks. The next anti-light pattern will have potent PETROSPHERES all over again, but this time players will need to levitate after the explosion to avoid earthquake. Essentially, it's the same mechanic, so don't forget to hit that duty button. From this point on, all mechanics will repeat until the boss is down. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll head into Deltascape version 3.0. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.